Hi, I'm Sarah. Last Thanksgiving in Denver, my brother Michael stood up at our family dinner, looked me dead in the eye, and announced to everyone that I was officially cut from the family tree. 22 relatives nodded in agreement, like they'd been waiting years for this moment. What they didn't know was that hidden in my purse was a thick manila envelope containing 8 years of financial records, every loan, every bailout, every midnight emergency call that had drained my bank account dry. By the time I was done revealing what was inside, 3 marriages would be destroyed, 2 family businesses would collapse, and the golden child they all worshipped would be exposed as the fraud he really was. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The November wind whipped through downtown Denver as I parked outside my childhood home in the Highlands neighborhood, the Victorian house looking exactly the same as it had 15 years ago when I'd graduated high school and left for college. The burgundy paint was peeling slightly around the window frames, and Mom's prized rose bushes had been cut back for winter, leaving thorny skeletons reaching toward the gray Colorado sky. I sat in my Honda Civic for a moment, watching the warm, golden light spill from the windows onto the front porch, where we used to carve pumpkins every October. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, another text from my sister-in-law Jennifer asking if I could swing by the store and grab some wine since she'd totally forgotten and the liquor stores would be closing soon. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, before typing back a simple, "Sure," like I always did. Like I'd been doing for 8 years. Jennifer never forgot anything. She just knew I'd handle it without complaint. The grocery store was packed with last-minute Thanksgiving shoppers, harried parents pushing overflowing carts while kids begged for candy at the checkout. I grabbed 2 bottles of the good stuff, the kind that cost $40 each because Jennifer had specifically mentioned wanting something nice for the occasion. As I handed my credit card to the cashier, I calculated quickly in my head, $80 for wine, plus the $100 I'd already spent on the organic turkey Michael had requested, plus the $50 for the specialty ingredients for Mom's stuffing, recipe that nobody else wanted to spring for. $230 before I'd even walked through the front door. The house smelled like sage and butter when I finally made it inside, my arms loaded with grocery bags and wine bottles. The familiar chaos of a large family gathering hit me immediately, voices overlapping in conversation, children running between rooms, the television blaring a football game that nobody was really watching. I recognized most of the faces scattered throughout the living room and kitchen, but noticed how few people looked up when I entered. My cousin David gave me a quick wave from the couch where he was scrolling through his phone, and Aunt Patricia called out a distracted, "Oh good, you made it," before returning to her conversation about someone's divorce. Mom appeared from the ID kitchen wearing her favorite apron, the one with dancing turkeys that she'd owned for as long as I could remember. She looked frazzled, wisps of gray hair escaping from her usually perfect bun, flour smudged across her cheek. When she saw me struggling with the bags, she rushed over with that worried expression she always wore when hosting family events. "Sarah, honey, thank goodness you're here," she said, taking the wine bottles from my arms. "The oven is acting up again, and I think we might need to call someone to look at it. Do you know anyone who does appliance repair?" She didn't wait for an answer before continuing. "And your brother is stressed about work, so try not to bring up anything controversial today, okay? You know how he gets." I knew exactly how Michael got. I'd been managing his moods and everyone else's for most of my adult life. While they saw Michael as the successful architect with the beautiful wife and 2 perfect kids, I saw the man who called me at midnight when his business was hemorrhaging money, who borrowed thousands for equipment investments that never materialized, who treated our family gatherings like board meetings where he held court while everyone else scrambled to accommodate his needs. The dining room had been expanded with a folding table to accommodate everyone, creating an L-shaped seating arrangement that stretched from the formal dining area into the adjacent breakfast nook. 22 people would be sitting down to dinner, which meant Mom had been cooking for 3 days straight. I found her list on the kitchen counter, written in her careful cursive on yellow legal pad paper. Everything was accounted for except the items that had been delegated to others, which mostly meant delegated to me. Jennifer appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking effortlessly elegant in a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than I made in a week. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled in loose waves, and her makeup looked like she'd just stepped out of a salon. She was one of those women who made everything look easy, which was ironic considering how often she needed help with the most basic tasks. "Sarah, you're a lifesaver with the wine," she said, giving me one of her practiced smiles. "I've been running around all morning with the kids, and I completely spaced on it. You know how it is." She gestured vaguely toward the living room where her 8-year-old son Connor was methodically destroying a Lego creation, while her 5-year-old daughter Sophia demanded someone change the TV channel. I didn't know how it was, actually. I didn't have kids, partly by choice and partly because I'd been too busy financially supporting everyone else's children to build a life of my own. But I nodded anyway, the way I always did when Jennifer made these assumptions about our shared experiences. Michael's voice boomed from the living room, holding forth about some project his architectural firm was working on downtown. He had that commanding presence that made people listen, even when he was talking about mundane details like zoning permits and construction timelines. At 35, he still carried himself like the high school quarterback he'd once been. Broad shoulders and confident posture that suggested he expected the world to arrange itself around his preferences. "The city council is being ridiculous about the height restrictions," he was saying to Uncle Richard, who nodded along despite probably having no idea what Michael was talking about. "We're talking about prime real estate in the heart of downtown, and they want us to limit ourselves to 12 stories? It's economically irresponsible." What Michael didn't mention was that his firm was 3 months behind on rent for their office space, or that I'd quietly transferred $5,000 into his business account just last week to keep them afloat until their next client payment came through. He also didn't mention that the prime real estate project he was describing so confidently was still waiting for final approval, which meant his firm was essentially operating on the hope that everything would work out perfectly. I'd learned not to ask too many questions about Michael's business finances after the first few times he'd blown up at me for being negative and unsupportive. Instead, I just transferred money when he asked and tried not to think too hard about what it was really funding. His lifestyle certainly suggested more success than his bank statements reflected. The house in Cherry Hills, the luxury cars, the private school tuition for Connor and Sophia, the ski trips to Vail every winter. It all added up to more than an architectural firm with 3 employees could realistically support, especially when that firm seemed to be perpetually waiting for the next big break. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Cousin Lisa was in the kitchen helping Mom with last-minute preparations, chattering about her new job at a marketing agency while simultaneously posting photos to Instagram. She'd moved back to Denver 6 months ago after her engagement fell apart in San Francisco, and she'd been staying in Mom's basement while she got back on her feet. What was supposed to be a temporary arrangement had stretched into something more permanent, largely because Lisa spent most of her paycheck on clothes and dinner out rather than saving for her own place. "I'm thinking about getting my own apartment. Soon?" Lisa was saying to Mom while arranging dinner rolls in a basket. "There's this cute place in Rhino that I looked at last week. The deposit is a little steep, but once I get settled in the new job, it should be fine." She glanced at me as she said this, and I recognized the look. It was the same expression she'd worn 3 years ago when she needed help with her car payment, and 2 years ago when her credit card got declined at her college reunion dinner. The thing about being the family's unofficial bank was that people stopped asking directly after a while. Instead, They just started mentioning their problems in your presence and waiting for you to volunteer a solution. Lisa's steep deposit comment was really a question about whether I'd be willing to help her with moving expenses. Mom's concern about the oven repair was an assumption that I'd handle calling and paying for a service technician. Jennifer's wine emergency was a test of whether I'd step up without being asked. I'd been stepping up for so long that I barely remembered what it felt like to be asked for help, rather than simply expected to provide it. Somewhere along the way, my role in the family had shifted from daughter and sister to problem solver and financial safety net. The transition had been so gradual that I hadn't noticed it happening until I was already drowning in other people's emergencies. The irony was that my own life had become remarkably stable and boring in comparison to everyone else's constant drama. I worked as a senior analyst for a consulting firm downtown, lived in a modest apartment in Capitol Hill, and had built up a decent savings account through careful budgeting and smart investments. While Michael was leveraging everything on risky business ventures and Jennifer was spending beyond their means, I was quietly building the kind of financial security that everyone else seemed to think would always be available when they needed it. But stability, I'd learned, made you invisible in a family that thrived on crisis and excitement. Nobody asked about my promotion at work or my plans for the future, because I wasn't asking them to solve problems or provide emotional support. I was just there, reliable and dependable, ready to write a check or make a phone call or handle whatever practical issue needed attention. Dinner was finally ready around 4 o'clock, after the usual chaos of coordinating serving dishes and finding enough chairs and making sure everyone had drinks. Mom had outdone herself with the spread, traditional turkey and stuffing alongside, more adventurous dishes like butternut squash soup and cranberry pomegranate salad. Everything looked magazine perfect, which was exactly what Mom had been aiming for since she'd started planning the menu in early October. The seating arrangement had been carefully orchestrated to manage family dynamics and keep potential conflicts separated. Michael sat at the head of the main table with Jennifer on his right and Mom on his left. The kids were clustered together at the smaller table where they could make messes without bothering the adults. I found myself wedged between Cousin David and Great Aunt Helen, close enough to participate in conversations, but far enough from the center of attention to remain largely overlooked. As we passed dishes around the table and settled into the comfortable rhythm of a family meal, I felt that familiar mix of belonging and alienation that marked most of our gatherings. These were my people, the faces I'd grown up with, the voices that had filled my childhood with laughter and stories and love. But somewhere along the way, those same voices had started to sound different to me, tinged with expectation and entitlement that made every interaction feel transactional rather than genuine. Michael was telling the table about his latest project, painting a picture of professional success and creative fulfillment that everyone seemed eager to believe. Jennifer chimed in with supportive comments about how hard he'd been working and how proud she was of his dedication. Mom beamed with maternal pride, asking questions that allowed Michael to elaborate on his achievements and future plans. I listened to the conversation while picking at my turkey, remembering the panicked phone call I'd received just 2 weeks earlier when Michael's biggest client had delayed their payment by 3 months. He'd been frantic about making payroll for his employees, his voice tight with stress as he explained how the delay would cascade through all of his other financial obligations. Without thinking twice, I'd agreed to transfer $15,000 to cover his immediate needs, money that came out of the emergency fund I'd been building for my own future. But listening to him now, you'd never know that his success was built on such shaky foundations. He spoke with complete confidence about upcoming projects and expansion plans, as if the financial crisis from 2 weeks ago had been completely resolved rather than simply postponed. It was a masterful performance, and everyone at the table was buying it completely. That's when I realized that Michael had become an expert at rewriting history to match his preferred narrative. The desperate phone calls and emergency loans disappeared from his version of events, replaced by stories of strategic business decisions and calculated risks. He wasn't lying exactly, but he was editing out all the parts that made him look vulnerable or dependent on others. The conversation moved on to other topics: David's new girlfriend, Lisa's job search adventures, Uncle Richard's plans for retirement. Everyone had stories to tell and updates to share, and the wine I'd purchased was making everyone more talkative and animated. It should have been the kind of evening I looked forward to, surrounded by family and good food and the warmth of shared traditions. Instead, I found myself mentally calculating the cost of everything I was looking at. The turkey I'd bought, the wine everyone was enjoying, the flowers Mom had asked me to pick up for the centerpieces, the expensive ingredients for dishes that others had volunteered to make but somehow I'd ended up purchasing. Even the children's entertainment for the evening, a collection of new movies and games that Jennifer had mentioned wanting to have available, had somehow become my responsibility to provide. As the meal wound down and people started to relax into that comfortable post-dinner lethargy, I excused myself to help Mom clear the dishes. The kitchen was a disaster zone of empty serving dishes and gravy-stained utensils, the kind of cleanup that would take hours to complete properly. Mom looked exhausted, the adrenaline of hosting wearing off to reveal the fatigue underneath. "You don't have to help, honey," she said automatically, but her relief was obvious when I started loading the dishwasher. "I can handle this tomorrow." We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, scraping plates and sorting silverware into the dishwasher basket. It reminded me of all the holidays from my childhood, when helping with cleanup was just what you did as part of the family. Team? Back then, it had felt like collaboration rather than obligation. Everyone pitching in because that's what families do for each other. But even this simple act of service had become complicated over the years. I wasn't just helping with dishes. I was also the one who would quietly slip Mom an extra $100 tomorrow to help with the grocery bills she couldn't quite afford. I wasn't just clearing the table. I was also mentally calculating how much money I'd need to transfer to Michael's account next week, when his payroll crisis inevitably resurfaced. "Sarah," Mom said quietly, glancing toward the dining room to make sure we weren't being overheard. "I need to talk to you about something." My stomach dropped, recognizing the tone she used when she was about to ask for another favor. "Not tonight," I thought. "Please not tonight." "The property taxes on the house are due next month," she continued, her voice carefully neutral. "And with Dad's medical bills from last year, I'm still catching up on everything. I was wondering if you might be able to help me out, just until I can get things sorted out." There it was. The real reason I'd been seated next to Great Aunt Helen instead of with the rest of the family. The real reason Mom had been extra appreciative of my help with the groceries and cooking preparations. She'd been working up to this conversation all day, waiting for the right moment when we were alone and I couldn't easily refuse without making a scene. "How much do you need?" I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew the answer. Property taxes on a house in the Highlands neighborhood weren't cheap, especially when you were dealing with the kind of assessed value increases that had been happening throughout Denver. "About $4,000, she said, not meeting my eyes. "I know it's a lot, and I wouldn't ask if I had any other options. But you know how things have been since your father died." I did know how things had been. I knew because I'd been quietly subsidizing Mom's life for the past 3 years, covering everything from utility bills to car repairs to medical expenses. What was supposed to be temporary help while she adjusted to life on a fixed income had become a permanent arrangement that neither of us talked about directly. "Of course," I heard myself saying, the words automatic after years of practice. "I can transfer it tomorrow." Mom's relief was immediate and profound, her shoulders dropping as the tension she'd been carrying all day finally released. She squeezed my arm gratefully and murmured something about paying me back when her next Social Security check arrived, though we both knew that would never happen. Her monthly income barely covered basic living expenses. There was never anything left over. For paying back loans? We finished cleaning the kitchen in silence, both of us pretending that the conversation hadn't fundamentally changed the dynamic of our relationship once again. I wasn't just Mom's daughter helping with holiday cleanup. I was her financial lifeline. The person who stood between her and the possibility of losing the house she'd lived in for 30 years. When we returned to the dining room, the conversation had shifted to holiday plans and family gossip. Jennifer was showing everyone photos from Connor's recent soccer tournament, while Michael held forth about some restaurant they'd discovered during their last anniversary trip to Napa Valley. The wine had made everyone more relaxed and talkative, and the mood was exactly what you'd want from a successful family gathering. But something had shifted for me during that conversation in the kitchen. Maybe it was the casual way Mom had approached me about the property taxes. Or maybe it was the realization that even this holiday celebration was partially funded by my savings account. Whatever it was, I found myself looking around the table with different eyes, seeing patterns that I'd been too close to notice before. Every conversation seemed to circle back to someone's problems or needs. David was stressed about his student loan payments. Lisa was worried about her car registration fees. Uncle Richard was concerned about his wife's prescription costs. Even Great Aunt Helen was discussing the rising costs of her assisted living facility with anyone who would listen. And somehow, without anyone explicitly saying it, all of these problems were gradually becoming my problems to solve. Not because anyone demanded it, but because I'd established myself as the person who could handle financial emergencies without falling apart. I was the stable one, the responsible one, the one who had her life together enough to help everyone else hold theirs together too. The realization hit me like cold water. I wasn't a member of this family anymore. I was a resource. The coffee shop on 17th Street had become my unofficial office for these conversations, the kind of place where nobody would overhear family business or judge me for crying into my latte. I'd been meeting my friend Rachel here every few weeks for the past 2 years. Initially just to catch up, but increasingly to process the growing complexity of my family dynamics. Rachel worked as a therapist, which made her both an excellent listener and occasionally too insightful for my comfort. "So let me get this straight," Rachel said, stirring honey into her tea while I recounted the previous week's family emergencies. "Michael needed $8,000 for equipment. Your mom needed $4,000 for property taxes, and Lisa needed $1,200 for her security deposit, all in the same week." When she put it like that, it sounded ridiculous even to me. But each request had come with its own urgent timeline and compelling backstory, making it impossible to step back and see the bigger picture until Rachel forced me to lay it all out chronologically. "They don't coordinate," I said defensively, though I was starting to wonder if that was really true. "It's just bad timing that everything hit at once." Rachel raised an eyebrow but didn't comment directly on my denial. Instead, she asked the question that I'd been avoiding for months. "How much money are we talking about total? Like, if you added up everything you've given them over the past year?" I'd been keeping track, of course. My accounting background made it impossible not to monitor cash flow, even when the expenditures were personal rather than professional. But I'd been tracking the numbers without really processing what they meant, the way you might monitor an investment account without thinking too hard about whether you could afford to lose that money. "Around $37,000 last year," I admitted, watching Rachel's eyes widen. "But some of that was investments in Michael's business, not gifts. And the mortgage payments for Mom are more like rent, since I'm technically building equity in the house." Rachel set down her teacup carefully, the way she did when she was choosing her words with therapeutic precision. "Sarah, I want you to hear yourself right now. You're justifying $37,000 in family expenses by calling them investments and rent payments. But are you actually getting returns on those investments? Are you actually building equity in your mom's house?" The answer was no, obviously. Michael's business investments had never generated returns because his company never quite achieved the profitability he projected, and Mom's house was still entirely in her name, which meant my mortgage payments were essentially gift payments with no legal protection for me if something happened to her. But acknowledging those facts felt like betraying my family, like admitting that I'd been naive about their intentions rather than generous with my resources. It was easier to maintain the fiction that these were temporary loans and strategic investments, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. "They're family," I said, falling back on the explanation that had justified every questionable financial decision for the past 8 years. "You help family when they need it." "Of course you do," Rachel agreed, but her tone suggested there was more to that statement. "But help goes both ways in healthy families. When was the last time someone in your family helped you with something significant? Not just emotional support or advice, but actual practical help that cost them something?" I opened my mouth to respond and then closed it again, realizing I couldn't think of a single example. When I'd been sick with pneumonia 2 winters ago, I'd managed my own care and missed work without asking anyone for help. When my car had been totaled in a hailstorm, I'd handled the insurance claim and car shopping entirely on my own. When I'd been considering a career change last year, I'd researched options and made decisions without consulting anyone, because I knew they'd just worry about how it might affect my ability to help them financially. Somewhere along the way, I'd become the helper rather than someone who received help. The family had reorganized itself around my capability and resources, with everyone else cast in the role of crisis-prone dependents who needed regular rescue. It was a dynamic that served everyone's needs except mine. "I think they've forgotten that I might need things too," I said slowly, the admission feeling both obvious and revolutionary. "Or maybe they assume I have everything figured out because I'm the one with money." Rachel nodded, recognizing the breakthrough moment that therapists learn to identify. "What would happen if you told them you needed help with something? Something that required them to inconvenience themselves or spend money they couldn't easily afford?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I tried to imagine calling Michael to ask for help with anything significant, but the scenario felt absurd. He was always in crisis mode, always juggling multiple emergencies that required immediate attention. Asking him for help would mean admitting that his problems weren't more important than mine, which felt selfish and unrealistic. The same logic applied to everyone else in the family. Mom was struggling financially and emotionally since Dad's death. Lisa was rebuilding her life after a devastating breakup. David was drowning in student debt and entry-level job stress. Everyone had compelling reasons why they couldn't be expected to help anyone else, which conveniently left me as the only family member with sufficient resources and stability to be a helper, rather than someone who needed help. "I think they'd panic," I admitted. "Not because they don't care about me, but because it would disrupt their assumption that I'm the stable one who has everything under control." Rachel smiled sadly, the expression she wore when clients finally identified the core issue they'd been dancing around for months. "And what happens to you when you're always the stable one? When you're never allowed to have problems or needs or vulnerabilities?" The answer was isolation, though I hadn't recognized it until that moment. I'd become increasingly disconnected from my own life, so focused on managing everyone else's crises that I'd stopped paying attention to my own goals and desires. I worked long hours, partly because I enjoyed my job, but mostly because it was easier than going home to an empty apartment and thinking about what I actually wanted from life. My social circle had shrunk to work colleagues and a few close friends like Rachel, people who knew me as Sarah the individual rather than Sarah the family problem solver. I'd stopped dating seriously because potential partners inevitably got frustrated with my financial obligations to relatives, viewing my family contributions as either excessive generosity or poor boundary setting. Either way, it made me a complicated choice for someone looking for a simple relationship. Even my professional advancement had stalled, partly because I was so focused on maintaining everyone else's stability that I hadn't been taking the kind of career risks that led to significant promotions. I'd turned down opportunities that required travel or relocation because I knew my family depended on my local presence and financial availability. I was living a smaller life to make room for everyone else's bigger dreams. "I think I need to start saying no," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. Not to everything, but to some things. Maybe to most things. Rachel leaned forward, slightly recognizing the significance of this shift. What would that look like practically? If you decided to start prioritizing your own needs and goals? I'd been avoiding this question for years because the answer felt too drastic and selfish. But sitting in that coffee shop with Rachel's patient, attention and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, I finally allowed myself to imagine a different version of my life. I'd move to a better apartment, maybe even buy a condo, I said slowly, testing out the words. I'd travel more, take some risks with my career, maybe go back to school for my MBA, something I've been talking about for 5 years but never actually doing because it would mean less money available for family emergencies. The more I talked, the more possibilities emerged. I could invest more aggressively for my own retirement instead of subsidizing everyone else's current lifestyle. I could date without worrying about how potential partners would react to my family's financial demands. I could make decisions based on what I wanted, rather than what everyone else needed. Those all sound like reasonable goals for someone with your income and education, Rachel observed. What's been stopping you from pursuing them? Guilt, primarily. The deep, persistent guilt that came with having more than other people and not sharing it freely. I'd been raised to believe that family came first, that personal ambition was selfish when other people were struggling. My parents had modeled this philosophy throughout their marriage, always prioritizing extended family needs over their own, comfort or goals. But I was starting to realize that their model had created a family system where nobody was truly independent or self-sufficient. Instead of teaching people to solve their own problems, we'd created a culture of dependency where crisis became a way to get attention and resources. Michael's business struggles were real, but they were also partly the result of taking risks he couldn't afford because he knew I would provide a safety net. The same pattern applied to everyone else. Lisa's financial instability was genuine, but it was also enabled by the knowledge that someone would always be there to cover her emergencies. Mom's fixed income limitations were real, but she'd also stopped looking for ways to reduce expenses because she had a reliable source of supplemental income through me. I think I've been enabling them, I said, the admission feeling like a betrayal even as I recognized its truth. Not intentionally, but by making their problems my problems, I've removed their incentive to find sustainable solutions. Rachel nodded carefully, understanding the complexity of family dynamics better than most people. Enabling isn't always conscious or malicious. Sometimes it comes from love and good intentions, but the results can still be harmful for everyone involved. The conversation continued for another hour, with Rachel helping me think through practical strategies for changing established patterns without destroying relationships entirely. It wouldn't be easy, and there would definitely be resistance from family members who had grown accustomed to my financial availability. But the alternative was continuing on a path that was making me increasingly resentful and isolated. By the time I left the coffee shop, I had committed to starting small. The next family request for money would get a different response than usual. Instead of automatically saying yes, I would ask questions about what they'd tried before coming to me, what their plan was for preventing similar problems in the future, and whether they'd considered other options for solving the immediate crisis. It seemed like a reasonable compromise between cutting everyone off completely and continuing to enable their dependency. I could still help family members who were genuinely trying to solve their own problems, while gradually reducing support for those who had come to view me as their primary solution to every financial challenge. The plan felt both empowering and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a cliff and preparing to jump. I'd spent so many years defining myself through my helpfulness to others that I wasn't entirely sure who I would be if I stopped playing that role. But I was curious enough about the answer to be willing to find out. 3 days later, Michael called with another emergency. His largest client had decided to delay their project by 6 months, which meant his company wouldn't receive the payment they'd been counting on to cover operating expenses through the end of the year. Without immediate intervention, he would have to lay off both of his employees and potentially close the business entirely. "I just need enough to cover payroll and rent for the next 3 months," he said, his voice tight with stress. "$25,000 should do it, maybe 30 to be safe. I know it's a lot, but this client delay is completely out of my control, and once things get back on track, I'll be able to pay you back with interest." It was the same speech I'd heard dozens of times over the years, with only the dollar amounts and specific details changing. Michael was always 3 months away from profitability, always dealing with circumstances beyond his control, always confident that the next big break would solve everything permanently. But this time, instead of immediately agreeing to help, I found myself asking the questions Rachel and I had discussed. What other options have you explored? Have you talked to the bank about a business loan or a line of credit? What about your other clients? Is there any way to accelerate payments from them? The silence on the other end of the phone stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Michael finally responded, his tone had shifted from desperate to defensive. "I thought I could count on family to be supportive instead of giving me the 3rd degree," he said coldly. "I wouldn't be calling if I had other options readily available. You know I've been working with the bank for months, but they want collateral I don't have. And my other clients are small potatoes compared to this delayed project." It was a masterful guilt trip, delivered with just the right amount of hurt disappointment to make me feel like I was being unreasonably suspicious of someone I should trust implicitly. The old version of me would have immediately apologized and offered to transfer the money that same day. Instead, I took a deep breath and tried a different approach. "I understand this is stressful, and I want to help. But $30,000 would wipe out most of my emergency fund, and I need to think about my own financial security too. Can we talk about a smaller amount that might buy you time to explore other options?" Another long silence, followed by a sound that might have been Michael suppressing a sigh of frustration. "Sarah, this isn't negotiable. I need enough money to keep the business running, or I lose everything. Half measures don't work when you're trying to save a company." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Michael alternating between explaining why his situation was uniquely desperate and expressing disappointment that I wasn't immediately offering the full amount he needed. By the end of the call, I had agreed to transfer $15,000, which felt like a compromise even though it was still more money than I had ever lent to anyone outside my family. But something had changed in the dynamic. For the first time, I had questioned the automatic assumption that Michael's business problems were my financial responsibility. I had acknowledged my own needs as legitimate considerations rather than selfish obstacles to helping family. It was a small step, but it felt significant in ways that Michael probably didn't recognize. The pattern repeated itself over the next few weeks with other family members. Lisa needed help with her car registration and insurance, but instead of simply covering the costs, I suggested she sell some of the designer clothes and accessories she'd been accumulating to generate cash for basic expenses. Mom mentioned that her heating bill was higher than expected, and I offered to help her research energy assistance programs rather than just writing a check. Each conversation was awkward and uncomfortable, with family members clearly confused by my new approach to their financial requests. They'd grown accustomed to a version of me that said yes automatically and asked questions later, if at all. This new version, who wanted to understand their problem-solving efforts and explore alternatives, felt foreign and potentially threatening to the established dynamic. The resistance was subtle but persistent. Michael started calling me less frequently, but when he did call, his tone carried an undercurrent of hurt that suggested I was failing to live up to family expectations. Mom began making comments about how independent I was becoming, using the word in a way that clearly meant selfish rather than self-sufficient. Lisa started sharing more details about her financial struggles with other family members, creating a network of concern and support that didn't include me. I was being gradually excluded from the family's emotional inner circle, not because anyone was angry with me exactly, but because I was no longer reliable as a source of unconditional financial support. The message was clear. If I wanted to maintain my relationships with family members, I needed to return to my previous role as problem solver and resource provider. The exclusion hurt more than I had expected. I'd known that changing my approach to family finances would create tension, but I hadn't anticipated how quickly I would be repositioned from essential family member to problematic outsider. It felt like punishment for asserting my own needs, which made me question whether I was being unreasonably selfish, or whether my family's reactions were confirming that my previous suspicions were correct. Rachel helped me process these developments during our regular coffee meetings, pointing out that healthy families should be able to accommodate members who set reasonable boundaries around their resources and availability. The fact that my family was struggling to accept my new approach suggested that their previous affection might have been more conditional than I had realized. Love that disappears when you stop giving money wasn't really love in the first place, she observed during one particularly difficult conversation. It was appreciation for your usefulness, which is different. The distinction was painful but important. I'd been confusing gratitude with affection, mistaking people's appreciation for my help with genuine care for my well-being. When I stopped being useful in the ways they had come to expect, their warmth diminished accordingly, revealing the transactional nature of relationships I had believed were based on unconditional family bonds. But recognizing the truth didn't make it easier to accept. I'd built my identity around being needed and helpful, and losing that role left me feeling unmoored and uncertain about my place in the family structure. If I wasn't the person who solved everyone's problems, who was I supposed to be? If my value wasn't measured by my willingness to sacrifice my own goals for everyone else's immediate needs, what made me worth including in family gatherings and conversations? The questions followed me through the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, as I tried to figure out how to navigate the holiday gathering with these new dynamics in place. I knew there would be requests for help, both direct and indirect. I knew my recent reluctance to provide automatic financial support would be a topic of conversation, even if nobody addressed it directly. And I knew that my family's perception of me had shifted in ways that would probably be evident in how I was treated and included in holiday activities. Part of me wanted to skip Thanksgiving entirely, to avoid the discomfort of seeing how my relationships had changed since I started prioritizing my own financial security. But avoiding the gathering would send a message I wasn't ready to send, suggesting that I was rejecting family entirely rather than just recalibrating my role within family dynamics. Instead, I decided to attend, but with different expectations and boundaries than in previous years. I would bring a dish to share and participate in conversations, but I wouldn't automatically volunteer to cover expenses or solve problems that arose. I would be pleasant and engaged, but I wouldn't sacrifice my own comfort to manage everyone else's needs and expectations. It seemed like a reasonable approach, but I had no idea how dramatically the evening would unfold, or how completely my family would reveal their true feelings about my worth to them. The conversation that had been building for months was about to explode in ways that would change everything permanently, though I couldn't have predicted that as I prepared for what I assumed would be just another slightly awkward family gathering. The notification arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports at my desk downtown. A simple email from my bank's fraud detection system, flagging an unusual pattern of large transfers from my checking account over the past 18 months. The algorithm had identified what it called potential financial exploitation, based on the frequency and amounts of payments to individuals rather than businesses or standard bill payments. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling oddly vindicated and simultaneously embarrassed that a computer program had recognized something I'd been too close to see clearly. The bank was offering a complimentary consultation with a financial advisor to discuss protective strategies for managing personal finances in complex family situations. The language was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. They thought I was being taken advantage of. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown office building that offered sweeping views of the Rocky Mountains. The advisor, a woman named Patricia Chen, who looked to be about my age, had clearly reviewed my account history in detail before our appointment. I want to start by saying that there's nothing illegal or inherently problematic about supporting family members financially, she began, spreading printed statements across the mahogany table between us. But the pattern we're seeing here suggests you might benefit from some structure around these transfers. The numbers were stark when laid out chronologically. What had started as occasional emergency assistance had grown into a substantial monthly expense that rivaled my mortgage payment. Over the past 2 years, I'd transferred nearly $80,000 to various family members, with the amounts increasing rather than decreasing over time. The concerning aspect isn't the generosity, Patricia continued, highlighting specific transactions with a yellow marker. It's the lack of any reciprocal pattern. In healthy financial relationships, even within families, you typically see some flow of resources in both directions. Emergency help goes out, but eventual repayment or other forms of support come back. She was right, of course. My account showed a steady stream of outgoing transfers, with virtually nothing coming back except occasional small payments that covered maybe 5% of what I'd provided. Even more telling was the pattern of requests, which clustered around my payday and bonus payments, suggesting that family members were monitoring my income cycle and timing their crises accordingly. "What would you recommend?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Patricia pulled out a folder containing sample documents and forms. "We typically suggest establishing formal loan agreements for any amount over a certain threshold, say $2,000. This protects everyone involved by creating clear expectations about repayment terms and ensuring that both parties understand their obligations." The idea of asking Michael to sign a promissory note for his business loans felt absurd and mercenary, but Patricia's next observation gave me pause. Informal family loans often create more relationship problems than formal ones, because nobody's expectations are clearly defined. The borrower might genuinely believe they're receiving a gift, while the lender assumes eventual repayment. Those mismatched assumptions cause resentment on both sides. She had a point. I'd been frustrated by the lack of repayment from family members, but I'd never actually specified that I expected the money back. My loans were presented as temporary help during difficult times, but I'd never established timelines or consequences for non-payment. From their perspective, my continued willingness to provide assistance might suggest that I didn't really need or expect repayment. The other recommendation I have is establishing a dedicated budget line for family assistance, Patricia continued, pulling up a sample spreadsheet on her laptop. Decide how much you're comfortable giving away each year, and once you've reached that limit, any additional requests get deferred to the following year. The concept was both logical and revolutionary. Instead of treating each family crisis as an isolated emergency requiring immediate response, I could view them as predictable expenses that needed to be planned and managed like any other budget category. If someone needed help beyond my annual allocation, they would need to wait or find alternative solutions. What if there's a genuine emergency that exceeds the budget? I asked, thinking about medical crises or job losses that couldn't be postponed. That's where the formal loan agreements become important, Patricia explained. True emergencies get addressed through structured lending with clear repayment expectations. Everything else falls under the gift category and has to fit within your annual allocation. By the end of the meeting, I had a comprehensive plan for restructuring my family financial relationships. New requests would be evaluated against preset criteria and budget limits. Existing informal debts would be converted to formal agreements with payment schedules. And most importantly, I would start treating my own financial goals as non-negotiable priorities rather than flexible objectives that could be indefinitely postponed for other people's needs. The changes felt both empowering and terrifying. I was finally taking control of a situation that had been controlling me. But I knew the transition would create conflict with family members who had grown accustomed to a very different dynamic. The question was whether our relationships could survive the shift from unconditional financial availability to structured, limited assistance. I started implementing the new system immediately, beginning with a conversation with Mom about converting her ongoing mortgage assistance to a formal rental agreement. If I was going to continue helping with her housing costs, we needed clear documentation about what I was paying for and what rights that gave me in terms of the property. "I don't understand why we need paperwork for family helping family," Mom said when I explained the proposal during our weekly phone call. "It feels so cold and businesslike when we're talking about my home." Her resistance was predictable, but still disappointing. I'd hoped she would understand that formal agreements actually protected both of us by preventing misunderstandings about expectations and obligations. Instead, she seemed to view my request for documentation as evidence that I didn't trust her, which missed the point entirely. "It's not about trust," I explained patiently. "It's about clarity. Right now, neither of us knows exactly what our arrangement means long-term. Are these payments building equity for me? Are they gifts that I should deduct from any future inheritance? What happens if you decide to sell the house, or if something happens to you?" The questions were practical and reasonable, but they forced Mom to confront aspects of our financial relationship that she'd preferred to keep vague and undefined. As long as my payments were characterized as temporary help during a difficult transition, she could maintain the fiction that she wasn't dependent on my income for basic housing security. Creating formal documentation would require acknowledging that her financial situation was more permanently challenging than either of us had wanted to admit. It would also establish my legal rights as someone who was contributing significantly to her housing costs, which might feel threatening to her sense of independence and ownership. "Let me think about it," she said finally, using the tone that typically meant she hoped the subject would disappear if she avoided it long enough. But I'd learned from Patricia that successful boundary setting required follow-through rather than hope. "I'll need to know by the end of the month," I said gently but firmly. "If we can't formalize the arrangement, I'll need to start transitioning out of the mortgage assistance so you can make other plans." The ultimatum felt harsh, but it was necessary. I couldn't continue subsidizing Mom's lifestyle indefinitely without clear agreements about what that meant for both of us. If she wasn't willing to treat our financial relationship as a serious business arrangement, then it needed to return to a simple parent-child relationship without ongoing monetary obligations. Similar conversations with other family members went about as expected. Michael was offended by the suggestion that his business loans needed formal documentation, arguing that family relationships shouldn't be governed by contracts and legal paperwork. Lisa seemed confused by my proposal to limit family assistance to a predetermined annual amount, asking what she was supposed to do if she needed help beyond that allocation. The common theme in all these discussions was resistance to treating family financial support as anything other than unlimited emotional obligation. Everyone wanted to maintain the fiction that their requests for help were isolated emergencies rather than predictable patterns of dependency. And they wanted to preserve my role as someone who would always prioritize their immediate needs over my own long-term goals. But the conversations also revealed something I hadn't fully recognized before. None of them had ever seriously considered what my financial assistance was costing me, or how it might be affecting my ability to build my own future. They'd simply assumed that my willingness to help meant I could afford to help without significant sacrifice. When I started explaining that every dollar I gave them was a dollar I couldn't invest for my own retirement or use for my own goals, they seemed genuinely surprised. Michael actually asked whether I was having financial problems of my own, as if my desire to establish limits on family assistance must indicate that I was struggling, rather than simply trying to be more intentional about my resources. The lack of awareness was startling, but also clarifying. I'd been so focused on presenting myself as capable and stable that I'd never allowed family members to see the trade-offs I was making to support them. They had no idea that my continued rental of a modest apartment was partly because I couldn't save for a house down payment while covering everyone else's emergencies, or that I'd postponed career development opportunities because they required investments I couldn't afford while maintaining my role as family financial safety net. By mid-October, it was clear that none of my family members were willing to formalize our financial arrangements or accept significant limitations on their access to my resources. Michael had stopped calling entirely after I'd insisted on loan documentation for his latest business crisis. Mom was making passive-aggressive comments about how independent I'd become, using the word as an obvious criticism. Lisa had started reaching out to other relatives for help, spreading the word that I was going through something that made me less reliable as a source of support. The exclusion was becoming more pronounced and deliberate. Family group texts that had once included me were happening without my participation. Holiday planning conversations were proceeding without input from someone who was apparently no longer considered a core family member. Even birthday celebrations and casual social gatherings were being organized around my absence rather than my presence. The message was clear. If I couldn't be counted on to maintain my previous role as unlimited financial resource, then I wasn't welcome in the family circle in any meaningful way. My relationships with these people had been more conditional than I'd realized, based on what I could provide rather than who I was as a person. The realization was both painful and liberating. I'd spent years believing that family love was supposed to be unconditional, and I'd been confused and hurt by the way my relationships seemed to deteriorate when I started setting boundaries. Now I understood that the love had never been unconditional, at all. It had been entirely dependent on my willingness to sacrifice my own interests for everyone else's convenience. Understanding the dynamic didn't make it easier to accept, but it did clarify my options going forward. I could return to my previous role and be welcomed back into the family fold, or I could maintain my new boundaries and accept that my relationships with these people would be permanently altered. There didn't seem to be a middle ground where I could be both financially protective of myself and emotionally connected to family members who viewed those two things as mutually exclusive. The decision became easier as Thanksgiving approached, and I realized how little I was looking forward to spending time with people who seemed to view my company as valuable, only insofar as it came with financial benefits. For the first time in years, I considered declining the invitation entirely, claiming work obligations or travel plans that would give me a legitimate excuse for avoiding what was sure to be an uncomfortable gathering. But avoidance felt like cowardice, and I was curious to see how the family dynamics would play out now that everyone's true priorities had been revealed. I wanted to observe how they interacted with me when they couldn't expect financial assistance, and I wanted to see whether anyone would recognize the irony of excluding someone for being insufficiently generous while simultaneously depending on that person's generosity for their own financial stability. More importantly, I was ready to stop pretending that these relationships were healthier than they actually were. I'd been enabling everyone's denial about the transactional nature of our family connections, and I was tired of being the only person who seemed concerned about the long-term sustainability of the dynamic. If Thanksgiving was going to be the stage for finally acknowledging what our relationships had become, then I was prepared for that conversation. I'd been documenting financial transactions for years without really considering how that information might be useful beyond personal budgeting. Now I realized that those records told a story about family priorities and values that everyone needed to confront honestly. The folder I'd been keeping grew thicker as I printed out bank statements, loan requests, and text message conversations that revealed the full scope of how family members had been approaching our financial relationships. 8 years of evidence that showed a clear pattern of escalating requests, diminishing gratitude, and increasing entitlement to my resources. I wasn't planning to weaponize the information, exactly, but I was prepared to defend myself if family members decided to make my new boundaries a public issue during the holiday gathering. If they wanted to characterize my desire for financial self-protection as selfishness or betrayal, then they should be prepared to discuss exactly what I'd been protecting myself from. The anticipation was both stressful and energizing. For years, I'd been the family member who absorbed criticism and accepted responsibility for other people's problems without fighting back or defending my own interests. This Thanksgiving, if anyone decided to attack my character or question my commitment to family, they were going to discover a very different version of me than the one they'd grown accustomed to managing. I spent the week before Thanksgiving organizing my documentation and preparing for various conversation scenarios. If Michael wanted to discuss my lack of support for his business, I was ready to review exactly how much support I'd provided and how little accountability he'd offered in return. If Mom wanted to guilt me about being an ungrateful daughter, I could detail precisely how much gratitude I'd demonstrated through mortgage payments and emergency assistance. The preparation felt like getting ready for a legal proceeding rather than a family dinner, which was depressing but also clarifying. Normal families didn't require defensive documentation for holiday gatherings. The fact that I felt the need to protect myself with evidence suggested that my instincts about the unhealthy dynamics were correct. By the time Thursday arrived, I was as ready as I could be for whatever version of family confrontation might emerge. I'd prepared myself emotionally for criticism, exclusion, and potentially dramatic accusations about my failure to prioritize family obligations over personal interests. What I hadn't prepared for was the possibility that they would decide to formalize my exclusion in a way that would force me to respond decisively rather than diplomatically. The turkey was overcooked, and the conversation was strained, but everything seemed to be proceeding within normal parameters until Michael stood up during dessert and decided to make the subtext explicit. What happened next would transform our family permanently, though none of us could have predicted exactly how dramatic the transformation would be. The moment had been building for months, but when it finally arrived, it felt both inevitable and shocking. All the careful preparation in the world couldn't have fully prepared me for hearing someone I'd loved and supported for years declare that I was no longer welcome in the family I'd been financially sustaining. But I was definitely prepared to respond in ways that would surprise everyone, including myself. The dining room had grown uncomfortably warm as the afternoon stretched into evening. That particular stuffiness that comes from too many people in an enclosed space after a heavy meal. Conversations had been stilted all day, with family members making obvious efforts to avoid topics that might lead to discussions about money or recent changes in family dynamics. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what, until Michael pushed back his chair and stood up with the deliberate movements of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Before everyone starts heading out," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority he used in business presentations, "I think we need to address something that's been affecting our whole family." His eyes swept around the table, carefully, avoiding direct contact with mine while ensuring he had everyone's attention. "This is difficult to talk about, but we can't keep pretending everything is normal when it's not." The silence that followed was thick with anticipation and discomfort. Jennifer reached over to squeeze his hand supportively, while Mom looked worried but unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting this speech for weeks. Uncle Richard shifted in his chair and cleared his throat, but didn't interrupt. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, stopping their post-dinner fidgeting to watch the adults with curious, wide eyes. "Sarah has been going through some kind of personal crisis lately," Michael continued, his tone carefully modulated to sound concerned rather than accusatory. "She's become really difficult about family obligations, questioning everything, making people feel guilty for asking for basic support during hard times. It's created a lot of stress for everyone, especially Mom." I felt my face flush with anger and embarrassment, but I forced myself to remain seated and silent. This was clearly a planned intervention, orchestrated by Michael with the support of other family members who had grown tired of my new approach to financial boundaries. They'd decided that the problem wasn't their excessive demands on my resources, but rather my resistance to those demands. "I've tried to be understanding," Michael went on, warming to his theme now that he had the room's complete attention. We all know Sarah works hard and deserves to enjoy her success. But family has to come first, especially when people are really struggling. Dad always taught us that we take care of each other no matter what. The invocation of Dad's memory was a strategic masterstroke, designed to make any defense I might offer sound disrespectful to our deceased father's values. Michael had always been skilled at framing his own needs in terms of higher principles and family loyalty, making it difficult to oppose him without appearing selfish or uncaring. Mom dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, playing her assigned role in this carefully choreographed drama. "Your father would be so disappointed to see how divided we've become," she said quietly, her voice trembling with what sounded like genuine emotion. "He always said that family was the only thing that really mattered in life, and that we should never let money come between us." The irony was breathtaking. They were accusing me of letting money come between family relationships, when in fact it was their demands for money that had created the current tension. I'd been trying to establish healthier boundaries around financial support, and they were characterizing that effort as a betrayal of family values. Lisa chimed in from across the table, her voice artificially sweet but with an edge of vindictiveness that revealed her true feelings. "I just think it's sad that success has changed Sarah so much. She used to be so generous and caring, always, willing to help when someone needed it. Now she acts like every request is some kind of personal attack." The coordinated nature of their comments was becoming obvious. This wasn't a spontaneous expression of family concern. It was a planned confrontation designed to pressure me into returning to my previous role as unconditional financial resource. They'd decided that my new boundaries were unacceptable, and they were prepared to use emotional manipulation and public shaming to force me back into compliance. "We've talked about this a lot as a family," Michael continued, his voice growing more confident as he sensed support from around the table. "And we've decided that if Sarah can't remember what family loyalty means, maybe she needs some time to think about whether she really wants to be part of this family at all." The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. They were offering me a choice: return to my previous role as unlimited financial resource, or face exclusion from family relationships entirely. It was emotional. Blackmail disguised as tough love, and they expected me to cave under the pressure rather than risk losing my connection to the only family I had. Uncle Richard nodded gravely, adding his voice to the chorus of disapproval. "Sometimes people need to learn the hard way what they're throwing away. We've all bent over backwards to accommodate Sarah's new attitude, but there's a limit to how much patience family can be expected to show." Jennifer's contribution was perhaps the most galling, delivered with the false sympathy of someone who had never contributed anything meaningful to family relationships, but felt entitled to judge those who had. "We just want the old Sarah back. The one who cared about other people's problems and didn't make everything about money all the time." The old Sarah. The Sarah who had sacrificed her own financial security to enable everyone else's irresponsible choices. The Sarah who had never questioned whether her generosity was being appreciated or exploited. The Sarah who had defined her worth through her usefulness to other people rather than her own goals and achievements. That Sarah was gone, and I had no intention of resurrecting her for the comfort of people who had never truly valued her anyway. But I needed to respond carefully, because this was clearly a make-or-break moment that would define my relationships with these people permanently. "I think there might be some misunderstanding about what's actually been happening," I said quietly, reaching into my purse for the folder I'd brought as insurance against exactly this type of confrontation. "Before we talk about family loyalty and values, maybe we should look at what those concepts have meant in practice over the past few years." Michael's confident expression flickered slightly as he watched me pull out the thick manila folder and place it on the table. He'd been expecting tears, apologies, or angry defensiveness, not calm preparation for a fact-based discussion. The shift in my demeanor seemed to unsettle him, though he tried to maintain his authoritative bearing. "Sarah, we don't need to get into ancient history," he said dismissively. This is about moving forward as a family and getting back to the way things used to be. But I was already opening the folder and spreading documents across the table, creating a paper trail that told a very different story than the one Michael had been presenting. Bank statements, canceled checks, printouts of electronic transfers, screenshots of text messages and emails requesting emergency assistance. 8 years of financial records that revealed the true scope of my family contributions. Actually, I think we do need to look at the history, I said calmly, selecting specific documents to highlight the pattern of requests and payments. Because the way things used to be was unsustainable, and it's important that everyone understands what we're really talking about when we discuss family loyalty and support. The silence in the room had changed quality, shifting from anticipation to growing unease as family members began to recognize familiar bank routing numbers and their own names on transfer receipts. What had been intended as a private intervention was rapidly becoming a public accounting of family financial relationships. Mom reached for one of the bank statements with trembling fingers, her face pale as she scanned the monthly mortgage payments I'd been making on her behalf. "Sarah, why did you print all this out? This is private family business." "Because private family business became public family judgment," I replied evenly. "If my financial choices are going to be criticized in front of everyone, then everyone should have complete information about what those choices have actually involved." Michael was staring at a spreadsheet that summarized his business loans. By date and amount, his confident expression replaced by something closer to panic. He'd apparently never calculated the total amount he'd borrowed from me over the years, and seeing the number in black and white was clearly shocking even to him. "This is manipulative," he said, his voice rising with defensive anger. "You're trying to make us all look bad by focusing on money instead of relationships. Family isn't supposed to keep score like this." But other family members were now examining documents that revealed the scope of everyone else's financial dependence on my income. Uncle Richard was looking at records of the emergency loan he'd never repaid, while Lisa stared at a chronological list of her rental assistance, car repairs, and credit card payments. Jennifer had gone very quiet as she processed the total amount her family had received through Michael's business bailouts. "Family doesn't keep score," I agreed, "but banks do. And employers do, and retirement accounts do. Every dollar I've given to family emergencies has been a dollar I couldn't save for my own future or invest in my own goals. I kept track of this information for my own financial planning, not to shame anyone." David spoke up from his corner of the table, his voice uncertain as he studied a printout of student loan payments I'd made on his behalf. "I didn't realize it added up to so much. I thought we were just talking about a few thousand here and there." That was exactly the problem. Each individual request had seemed reasonable in isolation, but the cumulative effect had been massive. Over 8 years, I'd transferred nearly $90,000 to various family members, not including the ongoing mortgage assistance for Mom or the business investments that had never generated returns. "The issue isn't the amount," I said, though privately I was still shocked by the total myself. "The issue is that nobody ever acknowledged what these contributions meant for my life, or showed any interest in my own financial goals and priorities. I became a resource to be managed rather than a person with her own needs and dreams." Jennifer finally found her voice, though it came out smaller and more defensive than her usual confident tone. "We never asked you to keep track of everything like this. If you were going to resent helping family, you should have just said no from the beginning." It was a perfect example of the circular logic that had trapped me for years. If I helped, without complaint, my assistance was taken for granted and my needs were ignored. If I expressed any reluctance or established boundaries, I was accused of being selfish and uncaring. There was no way to maintain both family relationships and personal financial security under those conditions. "I did say no, eventually," I replied calmly. "And the response was to organize an intervention to pressure me into saying yes again. which tells me that my feelings about these financial arrangements were never really considered important. Mom was crying now, but not the gentle tears of earlier emotion. These were the harsh sobs of someone whose comfortable illusions were being stripped away in public. I never wanted to be a burden on anyone. I thought you were helping because you wanted to, because you could afford it. Her distress was genuine, and it softened my anger somewhat. Mom's financial dependence had developed gradually after Dad's death, and she'd probably convinced herself that my assistance was freely given rather than reluctantly provided. But her ignorance didn't change the reality of how her needs had constrained my choices. I did want to help, I said gently, but I also wanted to feel like my help was appreciated and that there were some limits to what I'd be expected to provide. When every boundary I tried to set was treated as a betrayal, I realized that this wasn't really about helping family. It was about maintaining everyone else's lifestyle at the expense of my own future. Michael was regrouping now, trying to regain control of a conversation that had spiraled far beyond his original script. Fine, maybe we haven't been as appreciative as we should have been. But this nuclear option of cutting everyone off isn't the answer. We're still family, and families work through problems together. But I was already pulling out the final set of documents, the ones that would make it impossible for him to reframe this as a misunderstanding that could be resolved through better communication. Formal loan agreements that I'd attempted to establish, email chains where I'd tried to discuss repayment plans, and his responses rejecting any structure around our financial arrangements. I tried to work through problems, I said, spreading out the correspondence between us. I asked for basic documentation about business loans, suggested repayment schedules, offered to formalize our arrangements so everyone's expectations would be clear. Every attempt at establishing healthy boundaries was rejected as unnecessary or insulting. The emails made for devastating reading, showing Michael's progression from grateful borrower to entitled demander to defensive avoider. In one particularly revealing exchange, he'd explicitly stated that family relationships shouldn't be corrupted by business formalities, conveniently ignoring the fact that his requests for money were already business transactions disguised as family emergencies. "You wanted me to treat our relationship like a bank," he said weakly, grasping for moral high ground that was rapidly disappearing beneath the weight of documented evidence. "No," I corrected. "I wanted you to treat our relationship with the same respect you'd show a bank. Acknowledgement of what you were borrowing, realistic plans for repayment, and recognition that my resources weren't unlimited. When you refused to do any of those things, you made it clear that you saw me as a more convenient option than actual financial institutions." Lisa was looking through screenshots of her own text messages, wincing at the manipulative language she'd used to request assistance over the years. I was really struggling during those times. I wasn't trying to take advantage of anyone. The defense was predictable but incomplete. Everyone had been struggling, including me. The difference was that I'd been expected to struggle in silence, while solving everyone else's problems, while their struggles were treated as family emergencies requiring immediate attention and resources. "Struggling doesn't excuse the way these requests were presented," I said, pointing to specific messages that demonstrated the emotional manipulation techniques Lisa had used. References to Dad's memory, guilt about my success, implications that refusing to help would prove I didn't care about family. Those weren't the communications of someone asking for help. They were pressure tactics designed to make saying no emotionally impossible. Uncle Richard was the first to attempt a complete retreat from the confrontation, gathering his coat and mumbling about needing to leave early for another obligation. His wife followed quickly, both of them avoiding eye contact as they made their excuses and headed for the door. Their departure seemed to break whatever spell had been holding everyone else in place. Within minutes, the exodus was in full swing. Jennifer was frantically gathering her children and their belongings, while Michael stood frozen at the table, still staring at the financial documents as if he could will them out of existence. Mom had retreated to the kitchen where I could hear her running water and aggressively washing dishes as a way of avoiding further conversation. Lisa was the last to leave the dining room, pausing at the doorway to deliver one final attempt at making me the villain in this scenario. "I hope you're happy with yourself," she said bitterly. "You've destroyed this family over money. Dad would be ashamed of what you've become." But the accusation no longer had the power to wound me the way it once would have. I'd spent too many months understanding the real dynamics at play to be manipulated by false appeals to family values or Dad's memory. Our father had never expected any of his children to bankrupt themselves for the other's convenience, and he certainly wouldn't have supported the kind of emotional blackmail that had been deployed against me. Dad would be proud that I finally learned to value myself enough to stop enabling other people's irresponsibility, I replied evenly. And he'd be disappointed that his other children confused love with financial exploitation. After everyone had gone, I helped Mom finish cleaning. Up an awkward silence. The kitchen felt cavernous with just the two of us, the absence of family chatter making every sound echo strangely. I could tell she wanted to say something about what had happened, but she seemed uncertain about how to approach a conversation that would inevitably involve acknowledging uncomfortable truths about our relationship. "I never meant for things to get so complicated," she finally said as we dried the last of the serving dishes. "After your father died, everything felt so overwhelming, and you were so capable of handling things. I guess I started depending on you more than I should have. It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to get. And I appreciated the effort, even though it didn't address the broader patterns that had developed over years, rather than just since Dad's death." Mom's financial dependence was real, but it was also the result of choices she'd made about budgeting and lifestyle, rather than purely external circumstances. "The dependence wasn't the problem," I said carefully, wanting to be honest without being deliberately hurtful. "The problem was that it became an expectation without acknowledgement. I was happy to help during the transition after Dad died, but temporary assistance became permanent obligation without anyone discussing what that meant for my life." She nodded slowly, processing the distinction between voluntary help and assumed responsibility. "What happens now? With us, I mean. Are you really cutting ties with the whole family?" It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating for weeks. The nuclear option that Michael had accused me of choosing wasn't something I'd planned, but it was rapidly becoming the most realistic path forward. My relationships with most family members had been irreparably damaged by the evening's revelations, and trying to rebuild connections with people who viewed me primarily as a financial resource seemed both impossible and undesirable. "I'm not cutting ties," I said slowly, "but I am changing the terms of engagement. No more financial assistance without formal agreements, no more emergency rescues for preventable problems, and no more accepting guilt or manipulation for prioritizing my own financial security." Mom looked relieved that I wasn't declaring complete estrangement, but also worried about what my new boundaries would mean for her own situation. "What about the house payments? I know you said you needed formal documentation, but I really don't understand why that's necessary." The question revealed that she still didn't grasp the fundamental shift that had occurred in our relationship. She wanted to maintain the financial benefits of my assistance while avoiding the accountability that should accompany such significant support. It was exactly the kind of thinking that had created our current problems. "If you want me to continue helping with housing costs, we need a rental agreement that specifies exactly what I'm paying for and what rights that gives me," I explained patiently. "If something happens to you, I need legal protection for the money I've invested in this property. And if you decide to sell, I need clarity about whether I'll receive any portion of the proceeds." The practicalities of protecting my financial interests struck her as cold and businesslike, but they were essential for preventing future conflicts and misunderstandings. I'd learned that family relationships without clear boundaries inevitably became exploitative, regardless of anyone's good intentions. 3 months later, I was living in a new condominium in Stapleton, a bright 2-bedroom unit with mountain views and a small balcony that caught the morning sun. The down payment had come from money I would have previously spent on family emergencies, and the monthly mortgage was actually less than what I'd been contributing to Mom's housing costs and Michael's business crises. The silence from most family members had been almost complete since Thanksgiving. Michael had never responded to my follow-up email outlining repayment options for his outstanding business loans. Lisa had blocked me on social media and apparently told other relatives that I'd become money-obsessed and impossible to deal with. Uncle Richard and his wife had stopped acknowledging my existence entirely. Mom had eventually agreed to a formal rental arrangement after consulting with a lawyer who explained that my proposal was actually quite generous compared to market rate assistance. We spoke weekly by phone, and our conversations had gradually become more honest and less transactional as we both adjusted to the new boundaries. The loss of family relationships was painful, but also liberating. I'd discovered that my fear of being alone had been largely theoretical, based more on social expectations than actual personal needs. Without the constant stress of managing other people's crises, I had energy for pursuing my own interests and goals that had been dormant for years. I'd enrolled in an MBA program, something I'd been considering for half a decade but had never committed to because of the time and financial investment required. I'd started dating again, meeting people who saw me as an individual rather than an extension of family obligations. I'd even planned a trip to Europe, using vacation time and savings that would have previously been consumed by family emergencies. The most surprising discovery was how much more generous I could be when my giving was truly voluntary rather than obligatory. I'd started volunteering with a financial literacy organization, helping other women recognize and escape exploitative family relationships. I'd contributed to causes I cared about, making donations based on my values rather than my relatives' immediate needs. Real generosity, I learned, required choice and boundaries. When helping others became an expectation rather than a gift, it ceased to be generosity and became enablement. By protecting my own financial security, I'd actually become more capable of helping people who genuinely needed assistance rather than simply wanted someone else to solve their problems. The folder of financial documents was filed away in my home office, no longer needed as evidence, but kept as a reminder of the importance of documentation and boundaries in all relationships. The numbers told a story about family dynamics that had taken me years to understand, but they also represented a closed chapter in my life. I'd learned that love without respect wasn't really love at all, and that family loyalty couldn't be measured in dollars transferred or crises managed. The people who had declared me no longer family had inadvertently given me permission to build a life based on my own values and goals rather than their endless needs and expectations. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is the courage to walk away from relationships that diminish rather than enhance your life, even when those relationships are labeled as family. True belonging doesn't require you to bankrupt yourself, literally or emotionally, to prove your worth to others. In the end, stopping payment on their bills hadn't destroyed my family. It had simply revealed that the family I thought I belonged to had never really existed in the first place. What I'd lost was an illusion, and what I'd gained was the freedom to build something real and sustainable in its place. The spring rain drummed against the windows of my new office as I reviewed the final quarterly reports, the sound creating a rhythmic backdrop to what had become my favorite part of each workday. 6 months had passed since that explosive Thanksgiving dinner, and the silence from my former family had settled into something almost comfortable. I'd stopped checking my phone expecting crisis calls or guilt-laden text messages, and the absence of constant financial emergencies had created a space in my life I hadn't known I was missing. My promotion to senior director had come through in February, partly because I'd finally been able to focus entirely on my career without the distraction of managing other people's perpetual disasters. The salary increase was substantial, but more importantly, the role came with equity options and the kind of long-term financial security I'd been dreaming about for years while funding everyone else's immediate needs. The irony wasn't lost on me that my professional success had accelerated dramatically once I'd stopped subsidizing my family's lifestyle. Without the constant drain of emergency loans and crisis management, I'd had the mental energy to pursue challenging projects and the financial flexibility to take strategic risks that positioned me for advancement. The very stability everyone had taken for granted was now generating opportunities they would never benefit from. Rachel met me for lunch at a new restaurant in Cherry Creek, the kind of upscale place I'd always wanted to try, but had never felt comfortable spending money on when I knew Michael needed business capital or Mom was struggling with utility bills. The freedom to make choices based purely on my own preferences still felt novel and slightly guilty, though I was working on embracing the guilt as evidence of growth rather than selfishness. "You look different," Rachel observed as we settled into a booth overlooking the creek that gave the district its name. "More relaxed, like you're finally living in your own life instead of managing everyone else's." She was right, though the transformation had been gradual enough that I sometimes forgot how tense and anxious I'd been during the years of constant family crisis management. Sleep came easier now, without the midnight phone calls and emergency text messages that had once punctuated my rest with other people's urgent problems. My weekends were actually restful, rather than consumed by family obligations and financial planning for other people's needs. "I got a letter from Lisa last week," I mentioned casually, watching Rachel's eyebrows rise with interest. "She's getting married in July and wanted to invite me to the wedding." The letter had been a masterpiece of careful language, acknowledging that things had been difficult between us, while avoiding any specific reference to the financial issues that had driven our estrangement. Lisa had presented the wedding invitation as an olive branch, a chance to move past our differences and focus on family again. Reading between the lines, I suspected her fiancé had financial stability that made my contributions less essential to her lifestyle. "Are you going?" Rachel asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I'd thought about it, seriously, for several days, imagining what it would feel like to sit in a church pew surrounded by relatives who had spent months painting me as selfish and money-obsessed. The temptation to prove that I could be the bigger person was real, but so was my certainty that attending would be interpreted as forgiveness and an invitation to resume our previous dynamic. "I sent a gift and a polite decline," I said, pulling out my phone to show Rachel the response I'd crafted after several drafts. I wished her well, but explained that I'm not ready to pretend that nothing happened. She never acknowledged her role in our problems, so there's no foundation for rebuilding trust. The response had been met with predictable disappointment from Mom, who had called to express hope that Lisa's wedding might be a chance for family healing. But I'd learned to distinguish between actual healing, which required acknowledgement and changed behavior, and the kind of surface-level reconciliation that allowed everyone to return to comfortable patterns without addressing underlying issues. Mom and I had been meeting for coffee once a month since she'd signed the formal rental agreement for my mortgage assistance. The legal documentation had initially felt awkward and transactional to both of us, but it had also created clarity that made our interactions more honest and less fraught with unspoken expectations. She knew exactly what financial support she could count on, and I knew exactly what my obligations were. "How's your mom adjusting to the new arrangement?" Rachel asked, demonstrating the therapist's instinct for checking on family dynamics, even in casual conversation. The relationship had evolved in ways I hadn't anticipated. Without the constant undercurrent of financial uncertainty and unequal power dynamics, Mom and I had been able to have conversations about topics other than her latest crisis or my latest rescue mission. She'd started sharing stories about her own life and interests, rather than just her problems and needs. I'd discovered that she was actually quite funny and insightful when she wasn't focused on managing my guilt about her financial struggles. "She's doing better than I expected," I admitted. "The structure actually seems to have reduced her anxiety about money rather than increasing it." She knows she can count on specific help with housing costs, but she also knows that other expenses are her responsibility to manage. The certainty had apparently been liberating for Mom in ways she hadn't anticipated. Instead of hoping someone else would solve her financial problems, she'd been forced to develop her own strategies for managing her budget and addressing unexpected expenses. She'd found a part-time job at a local bookstore, not because she needed the money for survival, but because she wanted discretionary income that didn't require asking anyone for help. The transformation had surprised both of us. I'd assumed that establishing boundaries would damage our relationship, but it had actually made our interactions more genuine and less transactional. We talked about books, politics, her memories of Dad, my career goals, and dozens of other topics that had been crowded out during the years when every conversation eventually circled back to her financial needs. "What about Michael?" Rachel asked, knowing that my brother's reaction had been the most dramatically negative and that his business situation had been the most dependent on my financial support. I'd heard through Mom that Michael's architectural firm had indeed failed within 3 months of my financial withdrawal. The business had been more precarious than even I had realized, apparently sustained entirely by my emergency loans rather than actual profitability. Without access to my credit and savings, he'd been unable to cover basic operating expenses when his clients' delayed payments or projects fell through. The failure had been devastating for Michael and Jennifer, forcing them to sell their house and move to a much smaller rental property while Michael looked for employment with an established firm. Jennifer had been particularly bitter about the lifestyle changes, apparently blaming me for their financial collapse rather than acknowledging the unsustainable foundation their comfortable life had been built on. "He found a job with a big firm downtown," I said, sharing the updates Mom had provided during our most recent coffee meeting. "Good salary, steady work, none of the stress of running his own business. Jennifer is working part-time as a real estate agent. They're actually probably more financially stable now than they were when his company was hemorrhaging money." The irony was thick and obvious. Michael's business failure, which had seemed catastrophic at the time, had forced him into a more sustainable career path that didn't depend on constant bailouts from family members. He was earning less than he had during his brief periods of business success, but he was also spending less on the lifestyle and business expenses that had kept him perpetually on the edge of financial crisis. "Has he reached out to you at all?" Rachel asked, knowing that Michael's silence had been one of the most painful aspects of the family estrangement. There had been no direct communication from Michael since Thanksgiving, but Mom had mentioned that he'd asked about me during a recent family gathering I hadn't attended. According to her report, he'd seemed curious about my new condo and promotion, though he hadn't expressed any interest in rebuilding our relationship or acknowledging his role in its destruction. The lack of apology or accountability had initially hurt, but I'd come to see it as valuable information about Michael's character and priorities. Someone who could borrow nearly $40,000 from a sister over 8 years and then cut off all contact when she established boundaries wasn't someone I needed in my life, regardless of shared genetics or childhood memories. "I think he's embarrassed," I said, though I wasn't sure whether that was generous interpretation or accurate assessment. It's easier to maintain the narrative that I'm selfish and unreasonable than to acknowledge that he built his lifestyle on someone else's sacrifice. Rachel nodded knowingly, recognizing the psychological defense mechanism that allowed people to avoid confronting uncomfortable truths about their own behavior. "Admitting that you were right about the financial dynamics would require him to acknowledge that he took advantage of your generosity for years. That's a hard pill to swallow." The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself thinking about Michael's situation later that evening as I prepared dinner in my new kitchen. Part of me missed the brother I'd grown up with, the person who had taught me to ride a bike and defended me from neighborhood bullies. But that person had been gradually replaced by someone who viewed family relationships as opportunities for financial extraction, rather than mutual support and affection. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, which made it all the more insidious. Michael hadn't set out to exploit my generosity. He'd simply become comfortable with my willingness to solve his problems and had gradually increased his expectations until my financial support became an assumed part of his business planning. The progression from occasional emergency assistance to regular subsidies had been so gradual that neither of us had recognized how fundamentally it was altering our relationship. Understanding the psychology behind his behavior didn't make me any more willing to resume contact, but it did help me process the grief I felt for the relationship we'd once had. I wasn't mourning the loss of the person Michael had become. I was mourning the realization that the brother I remembered had probably been gone for years before I finally acknowledged it. The summer brought news that Uncle Richard was facing serious financial difficulties following some bad investment decisions and his wife's extended illness. According to Mom, he'd reached out to several family members asking for loans to help cover medical expenses and prevent foreclosure on their house. The irony of his situation, given his enthusiastic support for my exclusion from the family, was not lost on anyone involved. He asked if I thought you might be willing to help, Mom told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings, her tone carefully neutral to avoid seeming like she was pressuring me to respond. The request was both predictable and illuminating. Uncle Richard had been one of the most vocal critics of my selfishness during the Thanksgiving confrontation, but his own financial crisis had apparently clarified his perspective on the value of family members with stable incomes and savings accounts. The man who had nodded approvingly when Michael declared me unfit for family membership was now hoping to benefit from the very generosity he had criticized. "What did you tell him?" I asked, curious about how Mom had handled the awkward request. She'd apparently been more direct than I would have expected, telling Uncle Richard that he'd burned that bridge when he'd supported my exclusion from the family. Mom's protection of my boundaries had been a pleasant surprise, suggesting that she'd developed a better understanding of the dynamics that had led to our family's implosion. "I told him that actions have consequences," Mom said with uncharacteristic firmness. "He made his position very clear at Thanksgiving, and now he needs to live with the results of that choice." The support felt good, but it also highlighted how differently Mom viewed my situation, now that she had some emotional distance from the crisis and chaos that had characterized our family dynamics for years. With her own financial situation stabilized, through our formal agreement, she could see more clearly how other family members had been taking advantage of my generosity. I'd decided not to help Uncle Richard, not out of vindictiveness, but because doing so would undermine everything I'd learned about enabling and boundaries. His financial crisis was genuine, but it was also the result of poor decisions and a lifestyle he couldn't afford. Rescuing him would simply restart the cycle of dependency and entitlement that had poisoned so many of my family relationships. The decision felt both difficult and empowering. I had the financial resources to help Uncle Richard avoid foreclosure, but I also had the wisdom to recognize that such help would likely be neither appreciated nor effective in the long term. Instead of solving his immediate problem, it would probably just delay the reckoning he needed to have with his own financial choices. Fall brought an unexpected development when David reached out directly, asking if we could meet for coffee, to discuss what had happened with the family. He'd been relatively quiet during the Thanksgiving confrontation, more observer than participant, and his request for a one-on-one conversation suggested he might have a different perspective on events than the other family members. We met at a small cafe in Highland, walking distance from Mom's house, but far enough from downtown that we were unlikely to encounter anyone from my professional life. David looked older than I remembered, with the kind of stress lines around his eyes that suggested he'd been doing some serious thinking about family dynamics and personal responsibility. "I owe you an apology," he said, before we'd even ordered coffee, the words tumbling out like he'd been rehearsing them for months. I knew what was happening with the money stuff, and I didn't say anything because it was convenient for me too. That was wrong. The acknowledgement was more than I'd received from any other family member, and it caught me off guard. I'd prepared for defensiveness, guilt-tripping, or attempts to negotiate resumed financial support. I hadn't expected genuine accountability or recognition of wrongdoing. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, not wanting to discourage his honesty, but also not ready to immediately forgive years of exploitation just because he'd found the courage to acknowledge it. David went on to explain that he'd spent months after Thanksgiving thinking about the family dynamics and his own role in enabling the financial abuse I'd experienced. He'd realized that his silence during the years of crisis and emergency had been a form of complicity, allowing other family members to normalize their excessive demands on my resources. "I was grateful that someone else was handling all the family drama," he admitted, stirring sugar into his coffee with unnecessary focus. "It meant I didn't have to deal with Michael's business problems or Mom's financial stress or Lisa's constant emergencies. You were managing all of that, so I could just show up for holidays and pretend everything was fine." The insight was perceptive and painful. David had recognized something that the other family members either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge: that my role as family problem solver had been convenient for everyone, not just the people who were directly receiving financial assistance. My willingness to absorb crisis and stress had created a buffer that allowed other family members to avoid dealing with difficult emotions and complicated situations. "I don't need anything from you," David continued, anticipating that I might suspect his apology was motivated by his own financial needs. "I just wanted you to know that I understand what happened, and I think you were right to protect yourself." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with David sharing his observations about family dynamics and his own efforts to establish healthier boundaries with other relatives. He'd apparently decided to model different behavior rather than trying to convince anyone else to change their approach, which struck me as wise and mature. "Are you planning to stay in touch with everyone else?" I asked, curious about how he was navigating the family political landscape. David's approach was more nuanced than mine had been. Rather than cutting off contact entirely, he'd established strict boundaries around his availability for crisis management and financial assistance. He still attended family gatherings, but he no longer allowed himself to be drawn into drama or asked to provide emergency support for other people's poor decisions. "I figured out that I can love people without enabling their dysfunction," he said, echoing concepts I'd learned in therapy. "I can care about Michael without funding his business mistakes, and I can support Mom without taking responsibility for her financial planning." The distinction was exactly what I'd been trying to achieve before the Thanksgiving explosion made it impossible to maintain any family relationships. David had managed to find a middle ground that allowed him to stay connected while protecting his own interests, though I suspected his approach worked partly because he'd never been as deeply enmeshed in the family's financial dysfunction as I had been. By the time winter arrived, I'd settled into a routine that felt both foreign and natural after years of constant crisis management. My evenings were spent reading, cooking elaborate meals for myself, and pursuing hobbies I'd abandoned during the years when every spare moment seemed to be consumed by family emergencies. Weekends were for hiking, visiting museums, and social activities with friends who knew nothing about my family's financial history. The peace was occasionally interrupted by guilt about my estranged relatives, particularly during holidays when I found myself wondering how they were managing without my financial safety net. But the guilt was increasingly outweighed by relief and a growing sense of self-respect that came from finally prioritizing my own needs and goals. Christmas passed quietly, with just Mom and David joining me for a small celebration at my condo. The contrast with previous years was stark, but not unpleasant. Instead of the chaos and tension that had characterized large family gatherings, we had calm conversation and genuine enjoyment of each other's company. The absence of financial stress and crisis management allowed us to focus on actually celebrating rather than just surviving the holiday. "This feels more like how holidays should be," Mom observed as we cleaned up after dinner, her comment reflecting a growing appreciation for the peace that came with healthier family dynamics. The observation captured something important about what we'd all lost during the years of financial dysfunction. Holidays had become opportunities for family members to lobby for assistance and create drama around money rather than times for gratitude and connection. By removing the financial component from our relationships, we'd rediscovered the possibility of genuine family bonding. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from what had initially felt like devastating family loss. The forced independence had led to professional advancement, financial security, and personal growth that probably wouldn't have been possible while I was enmeshed in other people's problems. The painful process of establishing boundaries had taught me valuable lessons about relationships, self-worth, and the difference between helping and enabling. Most importantly, I'd learned that family isn't defined by biology or shared history, but by mutual respect, genuine care, and reciprocal support. The people who had declared me no longer family had been right in ways they probably didn't intend. I wasn't part of their version of family, which was based on obligation, guilt, and financial extraction. But I'd discovered the possibility of chosen family, relationships built on appreciation rather than need and affection rather than convenience. The folder of financial documents remained filed in my home office, no longer evidence for defense, but a reminder of lessons learned and growth achieved. The numbers told a story about the past, but they no longer defined my present or constrained my future. I'd stopped paying their bills, and in return, I'd gained something far more valuable than money: the freedom to build a life based on my own values and dreams, rather than other people's endless demands. True family doesn't cost you your peace, your security, or your self-respect. Sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to enable someone's destructive patterns, even when that refusal comes with the price of relationship loss. In the end, I hadn't lost a family. I'd gained myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.